Let me tell you something that will shatter the way you've been interpreting silence, especially from someone you loved who identifies with an avoidant attachment style. See, we've been conditioned to believe that when someone disappears, they don't chase. When they don't fight to keep us, it means they don't care. That's the logic society sells us. If he wanted to, he would. But what if I told you that when it comes to avoidance, that logic collapses? Because in avoidance, absence doesn't always equal apathy. It often masks a storm of unresolved emotional attachment. Avoidants don't beg. That's the headline. But the truth behind that headline is far more complicated and far more human. They disappear not because they're over you, but because they're overwhelmed by you. The emotions you trigger in them feel too big, too intense, too unmanageable. And instead of running toward you for resolution like a securely attached person might, they shut down. They disappear, but don't mistake that for peace. Don't mistake that for closure. Behind that disappearance is a brain stuck in survival mode. An avoidant distances themselves not because they don't feel, because they feel too much and have no internal framework to process it healthily. And here's the kicker: their silence is loud. In fact, it's screaming. Most people don't understand is that avoidants aren't emotionally numb. They're emotionally flooded. They grew up in environments where vulnerability was dangerous or unreliable. So, when intimacy starts to bloom, especially the deep kind that exposes their fears, their desires, their unmet needs, they retreat not because you're wrong for them, but because you're real for them, and real is terrifying. The avoidant mind says, don't let them get too close. You'll lose control. So, they ghost. They don't respond. They act like it never mattered. But that reaction isn't clarity. It's defense. That's silence. It's them holding their breath underwater, hoping the feelings pass without drowning. And guess what? During the so-called silence, they're not moving on the way you think they are. They're not free. No, what they've done is walk themselves into a prison of emotional repression. They're scrolling through your photos. They're revisiting that last message. They're remembering what you said when you were at your roast, but they won't tell you. They can't, because to say, "I miss you," would be to admit vulnerability. To an avoidant, vulnerability feels like stepping into fire without armor. Let me push this further. Imagine a person locked in a burning house, but every time you approach to help, they slam the door. That's the avoidant dynamic. Their disappearance isn't indifference. It's desperation wrapped in control. They leave not to forget you, but to protect the part of them that still needs you. And yet, they won't say it. They won't chase you down the hallway. They won't show up at your door with flowers and confessions. That's not how they're built. They've spent years, decades, even training themselves to detach before they're abandoned. Their mantra is leave first, I'm left. So when they disappear, they're not just leaving you. They're reenacting every time they weren't emotionally safe in childhood. You're not just their partner, you've become their mirror. What you reflect is too overwhelming to face. Now, I'm not here to tell you to chase them, to fix them, to decode every silent gesture they make. That's not your job, but I am here to tell you this. Mislabeled emotional silence is emotional absence. The two are not the same. You may be waiting for them to show up with a text, a phone call, a plea, but avoidants don't beg. Not because they don't care, because begging would expose the very thing they fear the most, that they love you more than they can control. They would rather suffer in silence than risk being vulnerable. They would rather lose you quietly than face the truth loudly. That's tragic, but it's real. So, what do you do with this? You stop expecting their love to look like yours. You start recognizing that their silence has a shape, and that shape often outlines you. You learn to listen to what their absence is actually saying, because in the world of avoidance, silence is a language. And that language, when decoded, often whispers the words are too afraid to say, "I still love you. I just don't know how to show it without losing myself." Let that sink in. Because once you understand this, you stop personalizing the distance. You stop internalizing the disconnect. And most importantly, you start protecting yourself without needing their validation. Because in the end, their silence doesn't mean you weren't loved. It means they didn't know how to survive loving you. Let that be the lesson and the freedom. Let's talk about one of the most confusing things people experience after walking away from an avoidant partner. The random, seemingly harmless messages, the subtle reappearances, the small digital footprints they leave behind. A text that says, "Hey, you're good." A meme they send you out of nowhere. A like on a photo from 8 weeks ago. At first glance, it feels like nothing, insignificant. But if you understand avoidant behavior, you know it's everything. Avoidants don't beg. They don't come back with apologies and tears. They're too afraid to expose themselves emotionally like that. Vulnerability feels like exposure, and exposure feels like danger. So instead of knocking on your emotional door, they drop breadcrumbs and they pray you'll follow the trail back to them. Now, here's the paradox. These are people who crave connection just as much as you do. The difference is they've trained themselves to fear it. So when they reach out with a small message, it's not small to them that, hey, they typed and deleted 10 times before sending. It's not casual, it's strategic. It's safe. It's their way of saying, "Are you still there? Is it still safe to love you without actually having to say anything that puts their heart on the line?" Avoidants are masterful at keeping one foot in and one foot out. They don't show up at your front door, but they leave fingerprints on your windows. And that's not a coincidence. It's a defense mechanism rooted in the fear of rejection. By making contact without fully committing, they can gauge your emotional temperature without risking emotional exposure. It's tactical, it's psychological. For many of them, it's all they know. Here's what most people get wrong. They assume that if someone really loved them, they'd fight. They'd break the silence with vulnerability. But avoidants fight differently. Their version of a love letter might come in the form of a meme, a late-night view on your story, or a song they randomly send that reminds them of you. And if you're not paying attention, you'll miss the depth behind the subtlety. You'll misinterpret their signal as weakness when really it's a confession hidden in code. That's the thing with avoidance. They don't love loudly, but when they do try to connect again, even if it's in the most indirect way, it's often coming from a place of genuine longing and deep emotional disorientation. And you know why they do it like this. Because if they can get you to respond, even just a little, they don't have to confront the shame they carry for how they pulled away. They don't have to admit fault. They don't have to say, "I miss you and I regret what I did." They just need evidence that the door isn't shut, you're still emotionally accessible, that they still matter. But you must understand these breadcrumbs are not always about reuniting. Often they're about emotional control. It's about keeping a connection alive just enough so they don't feel completely alone without stepping back into vulnerability. It's the psychological equivalent of breathing through a straw. They can't dive into love. They still need a little air from you. And every random check, and is them gasping for that air without ever jumping back into the ocean. And you're left confused. You wonder why reach out if you don't really want to come back. But you have to remember this isn't about logic. It's about emotion. Avoidants are emotionally intelligent enough to sense the loss, but not always equipped to process it. They won't say they miss you, but they'll make sure you see them. They won't ask you to come back, but they'll keep reminding you they're still there. Because for them, that's as close to intimacy as they can handle without losing their sense of control. And here's the challenge. You have to know what you're willing to tolerate. Because if you follow those breadcrumbs thinking they'll lead you to a new version of them, you might end up walking in circles. Avoidants often initiate just enough to pull you back into the emotional loop. But unless they've done the inner work, they won't follow through. They'll light the fire, but they won't sit by it with you. That's not cruelty. It's emotional immaturity meeting trauma response. So, if you're getting those small signals, pause before you romanticize them. Ask yourself, is this a bridge back to connection? Or is it a leash that keeps me emotionally tethered to someone who still doesn't feel safe being real with me? Because not every breadcrumb is a path forward. Sometimes it's a trap disguised as hope. Here's the truth. When an avoidant reaches out, it doesn't mean nothing. But it doesn't always mean everything either. It's a sign they're still emotionally attached, not necessarily that they're ready to love you the way you deserve. And that distinction, that's everything. Remember, a text doesn't heal a wound. A like doesn't rebuild trust. A breadcrumb doesn't equal a feast. Decipher the signs, but don't lose yourself in the code. Let's dive into something that will break every illusion you've been fed about emotional detachment. Because this next point will flip your entire perspective on what it actually means when an avoidant partner pulls away. Most people assume distance means disinterest, that when someone backs off, it's because they've lost feeling, that the emotional withdrawal is a sign they've mentally and emotionally moved on. But with avoidance, that is almost never the case. In fact, their withdrawal, their emotional recoil is often a direct result of feeling too much, not too little. That's the uncomfortable truth. Avoidants don't pull back because they're disconnected. They pull back because they're overwhelmed by the intensity of connection. They experience what psychologists call emotional flooding, where attachment triggers their inner alarm system. Suddenly, intimacy starts to feel unsafe, not because you are unsafe, because closeness threatens the fragile defense system they've built their identity around. It's not about you being too much. It's about you waking something up in them that they've spent years putting to sleep. You see, avoidants are not indifferent. They are hyper-aware of their own vulnerability, of the risk of being seen, of the danger of needing someone too deeply. So, when they start to catch real feelings, when love becomes less of a concept and more of a visceral experience, they retreat fast, hard, without warning. That's why many people feel blindsided. Things feel beautiful one day, intense in a good way the next, gone, cold, disconnected, and you're left wondering what you did wrong. But you didn't do anything wrong. You just got too close to a heart that wasn't used to being touched without armor. The deeper tragedy is this: the more they love you, the more they fear losing themselves. For an avoidant, love feels like emotional chaos. It threatens their control. It pushes them into unfamiliar terrain where their coping mechanisms, shutting down, distancing, staying detached, get short-circuited. They don't know how to stay present in love because presence requires vulnerability, and vulnerability for them has always been linked to pain, abandonment, or rejection. So what happens? They pull away to feel safe again. But ironically, this safety is just a temporary illusion. Because while they may have escaped the emotional intensity, they've also lost their chance at authentic connection. Here's the part that most people never understand when avoidants pull away. They don't stop thinking about you. They obsess silently. They analyze every interaction. They relevant moments on a loop. Instead of moving closer to resolve it, they get stuck in a loop of emotional paralysis. They're torn between the part of them that craves connection and the part of them that's terrified by it. This is the internal war they don't talk about. It's one of the loudest signs they're still in love with you despite the silence. So if you're on the receiving end of this pullback, don't rush to fill the space. Don't chase. Don't beg. Because what they need is a more closeness. It's more clarity within themselves. The more you pursue, the more it validates their unconscious belief that love equals loss of control. That love suffocates, that love invades. Instead, stand still. Let them feel the silence. Let them sit in their discomfort. Because only in that stillness will they be forced to confront what they're really running from, their own emotional depth. The truth is many avoidants have never experienced a secure emotional bond. So when you offer them genuine love, it doesn't feel comforting. It feels suspicious. They're looking for the catch. They're waiting for the rejection, preparing for the moment it all falls apart. And their instinct is to run before it does. But here's the irony. What they fear the most isn't losing you. It's losing control of their carefully managed emotional life. You simply by loving them fully threaten the identity they've built around self-containment. You crack open something raw, and that's terrifying for someone who has survived by shutting down rather than opening up when they pull back. Don't see it as a sign they don't care. See it as a sign they're not ready. And more importantly, ask yourself, are you willing to wait for someone who may never step into their readiness? You willing to mistake emotional retreat for romantic closure when really it's just fear in disguise? This is not about villainizing them. It's about recognizing that pulling back is their emotional self-defense. It's also a symptom of undealt with trauma. And if you keep personalizing it, you will end up internalizing wounds that were never yours to carry. So here's what you do with this truth. You stop chasing the silence. You stop trying to fix their retreat with your presence. And you start reclaiming your emotional energy from places where love is confused with survival. Because at the end of the day, someone who pulls back when they feel love isn't rejecting you. They're rejecting the risk of being truly seen. And no matter how deeply they care until they're ready to face their own fear, you will always feel like the threat. Let them go. If they're meant to come back, they'll return with readiness, not just affection, because pulling back isn't the end. But it is the truth. There's something haunting about the silence that follows an avoidance retreat. You don't hear from them, you don't see a message, you don't get closure, but somehow they're still present. And here's the truth that will blow past the surface-level assumptions. Even when an avoidant goes quiet, they don't let go. They just shift into a different form of connection, a distant one, a hidden one. But make no mistake, that invisible connection is still very much alive. They watch you, not always directly, not always openly, but they watch. Your stories, your posts, your pictures, your movements online. And it's not an accident, it's not boredom, it's not mindless scrolling, it's surveillance dressed up as detachment. Because while they've silenced themselves on the outside, internally, they're still plugged into you, still tracking your presence, still comparing the void they created with the life you're now living without them. Avoidants are masters at emotional distance, but they are also obsessive thinkers. They loop, they spiral. They can't stop themselves from wondering, are they thinking of me? Have they moved on? Do they hate me? Do they still feel what I feel? And because they can't ask you directly, because that would require vulnerability, they lurk from afar, searching for signs, signals, proof. It's their way of staying connected without confronting their own emotional discomfort. And here's where it gets psychologically rich. This kind of silent watching is not just habit. It's their subconscious attempt to regulate the emotional dysregulation they caused themselves by pulling away. They created distance thinking it would give them